letters from New Hampshire's Governor Hassan and from our Commissioner of Employment Security be entered into the record?
Without objection.
Thank you. As these letters show, the impacts of a failure to extend unemployment benefits are very real for thousands of working families in New Hampshire. And of course, that's true, we know, across the country. Failing to pass this legislation will hurt our economic recovery in New Hampshire. It will hurt the nation's economic recovery. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that the expiration of unemployment insurance will cost the economy 310,000 jobs, which is roughly the equivalent of a single month of job growth. And we know from economists from the Congressional Budget Office that each dollar we spend on extending unemployment insurance generates about $1.50 in economic growth. And it's one of the best places we can spend public dollars to try and stimulate this economy to create jobs that can ultimately put people who are unemployed back to work. And although the unemployment rate has gone down and our economy has shown signs of recovery, we still have a lot more to do. We have to get more people back to work. There is so much online for jobs, for hardworking Americans, and for our economy as a whole. So we should pass this legislation on behalf of workers and families in New Hampshire and across this country. And I also wanted to point out that I have filed an amendment to this unemployment insurance bill, and I hope we'll have a chance to vote on this amendment. It's identical to a bill that I've authored that has 19 co-sponsors, including the presiding officer, the Military Retirement Restoration Act. This legislation would replace the military retiree benefit cuts that have been included in the recent budget agreement, and it would do that by closing a tax loophole that some corporations use to avoid paying their share of taxes. This provision is designed to address corporations that set up shell entities and tax havens to avoid being considered an American company and paying at the tax rate in the United States. And they do that even though these companies are controlled and operated on American soil. It would ensure that those companies pay American tax rates. I think most people would agree that this kind of tax avoidance is unfair, that we should close this tax loophole, and we should do that rather than reducing military retiree benefits. In addition to the 20 co-sponsors of the legislation in the Senate, there is a similar bill in the House that has 46 co-sponsors. Now, my idea of how to pay for the military retirement benefit is just one idea. I know there are other bills that have been introduced, and I'm open to those other solutions. But I hope we can work in a bipartisan way to replace these cuts before they go into effect in 2 years. It's important that we address this issue for the men and women who have served this country so well, who have put their lives on the line for us. I hope we can do that as part of this legislation when we vote on it. If we're not able to do that, I certainly hope we're going to be able to address this in the near future. So thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise tonight to offer a few brief remarks, and I'm joined on the floor by my colleague, Senator Toomey. We're both here tonight to read a list of names of those who gave, as President Lincoln said a long time ago, the last full measure of devotion to their country, Pennsylvanians who lost their lives in Operation Enduring Freedom. We know that since the beginning of the conflict, Pennsylvania now has lost to date, the latest number I've seen is 92 killed in action. Tonight we'll read the names of 5 who gave that last full measure of devotion. Mr. President, before I turn to my colleague, it's very hard for me to fully understand or appreciate what the loss of a loved one means when they lose their life in war. We all often turn to quote Lincoln or the scriptures, and they're both appropriate. One of the best descriptions I heard was by the songwriter Bruce Springsteen. He was writing songs in the aftermath of of 9/11. And he had one song where the refrain was, "You're missing." And, of course, it could apply to a family who lost someone in war. One of the lines in that song goes something like this. He says, "You're missing when I turn out the lights, you're missing. When I close my eyes, you're missing. And when I see the sunrise, you're missing." I can only turn to words like that because I've never walked in those shoes of being part of a family who lost someone in Iraq or Afghanistan or in any conflict. So tonight, we pay tribute to those Pennsylvanians who gave so much to their country, and their family as well has given so much to their country. So I'm honored to be joined by my colleague, Senator Toomey, who will begin to read the names.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank my colleague, Senator Casey, for organizing this brief tribute that is just so much deserved by the service members we're going to be acknowledging in a few minutes. I'd like to begin by extending my deepest condolences to the family, friends, loved ones of these true Pennsylvania heroes. In the lives that they led and the cause for which they died, these men represent all that's great about this great country. Some enlisted right after graduating from high school, and during those very tough and grueling days and weeks in basic training, I suspect they'd never heard of the places in Afghanistan where they would make this sacrifice. These Pennsylvanians, of course, join a long list of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard members who've given their lives for this country, to include those who gave their lives in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and of course the ongoing war against violent radical Islamists all around the world. It's no accident that Pennsylvania has suffered so heavily in this conflict as it has in every other conflict in our nation's history. I think it's because in the towns across Pennsylvania, towns and cities such as Stafford and Moton, there's certain values that are deeply rooted in those communities: the importance of family, the importance of faith, the importance of serving this nation. There's a deep conviction that freedom is worth defending, and a belief that a cause worth fighting for is not just someone else's responsibility. These are the values that have helped shape these service members, their families, their churches, their houses of worship, and their communities. These values were exemplified in the lives of our fallen, who will forever be honored by our great Commonwealth for their service to this country. I'll begin reading the names of the men who made the supreme sacrifice for freedom last year in this conflict, and Senator Casey will complete the list. Chief Warrant Officer Matthew Paul Ruffner, U.S. Army, Stafford. Chief Warrant Officer Jarrett Michael Yoder, U.S. Army, Moton. Staff Sergeant Marek Soja, U.S. Army, Philadelphia. I yield the floor to Senator Casey.
Mr. President,
The senator from Pennsylvania.
I want to thank my colleague for starting the list, and I'll read the remaining names. And I should correct myself. I said 5 at the beginning, and I had the count wrong. It's actually 6 individuals. Staff Sergeant Thomas Basor, Jr., United States Army, Milton, Pennsylvania. Sergeant Patrick Hawkins, U.S. Army, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Staff Sergeant Patrick Quinn, U.S. Army, Corryville, Pennsylvania. Mr. President, as I conclude the list of Pennsylvanians who were killed in action over the past year, we want to say again we honor them, we pay tribute to them, and by this brief commemoration we remember them. We remember them, and we also remember the families they left behind. To quote Lincoln a second time, he once wrote to a family, and I'm quoting, "I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memories of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom." unquote. None of us could say it better than Abraham Lincoln did. But we offer that prayer tonight to the families. So to the families of our fallen heroes, from these and from other conflicts, please know that they and you are in our thoughts and prayers. Again, I want to thank Senator Toomey, and I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The senior senator from Connecticut.
I'm very pleased and proud to...
Oh, Senator, in a quorum call.
I apologize, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm very proud to follow my colleague from New Hampshire and thank her for her leadership in offering the Military Retirement Restoration Act, which I am very pleased to support, as an amendment to the Unemployment Insurance Extension Bill. For all the reasons that I've stated and others have expressed even more powerfully than I, this bill makes sense. We must extend unemployment benefits for the long-term jobless. And the merits of this bill are absolutely indisputable and undeniable. This bill offers us a really critically important opportunity, and we ought to seize it, to correct and fix a defect in the budget agreement that was reached by the very, very excellent work of our colleague, Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan, and that was passed overwhelmingly by a bipartisan majority in this body. It was an agreement that advanced and enhanced economic certainty. It had many advantages, but it also was far from perfect. Its flaws included a cut in military retiree benefits. These benefits were cut by provisions to that agreement that was approved by this body with many reservations and regrets, and now we ought to seize this opportunity to correct that defect, as this measure offers us through an amendment. And we can pay for it. It can be budget neutral if we simply close certain egregious corporate tax loopholes, as Senator Shaheen has suggested. And I want to emphasize again what Senator Shaheen said so well. We can think of a lot of different ways to pay for the $6.5 billion that's necessary to correct these cuts in military retiree benefits. What is beyond question is the need to fix this flaw. It's a flaw that not only diminishes in monetary terms the benefits these retirees need and deserve, it also dishonors the service and sacrifice that they have made. What better opportunity than now, as we deal with the extension of unemployment benefits in a measure that deserves overwhelming support, just as the budget agreement received, now to correct this flaw. There's been a lot of misinformation and confusion about exactly what the Murray-Ryan agreement did to military retirement benefits, and there is a need to address in the longer term this system that provides for retiree benefits to make it serve better the interests of our retirees, our veterans, our patriots who have given so much to our nation. But right now, in these next few days, beyond any kind of question or doubt, is the need to correct this defect and to follow through on the understanding that many of us had, including myself, that in fact we would correct this defect. I supported the budget agreement with the understanding, as Chairman Levin of Michigan made clear, that the Senate would work this year as soon as possible to stop the 1% reduction in the cost of living adjustments for military retirees until the age of 62 that would take effect in December of 2015. Now, 2015 and December of that year is a long way off. There may be other opportunities to correct this flaw, the reduction in retiree benefits, but let's do it now. Let us not delay in restoring the benefits that these retirees need and deserve. So I urge my colleagues to join in this effort, paying for this change by making sure that companies managed and controlled here in the United States can't avoid United States taxes simply by claiming foreign status. Many of us have long advocated closing this loophole. Seems to me a reasonable approach, far better than taking away the child tax credit for poor migrant families. But ultimately, the pay-for issue, the offset question should be resolved, and I believe it will be, if not in this act, then in the omnibus appropriations bill that we will address next, and then make sure that we keep faith. We must assure that we will keep faith with these retirees who have given and served so much. As Senator Shaheen has said, most Americans would agree that this kind of tax avoidance is unfair, and we ought to close this tax loophole rather than reducing military retiree benefits. What all Americans would agree is that we should keep faith and leave no veteran behind, making sure that this amendment is voted on and approved and given legal force and effect so that we correct and fix the flaw in the budget agreement that has really disallowed and dishonored the obligation that we owe these retirees. I thank the presiding officer, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, there'll be no roll call votes tonight. Mr. President, I think, as most people know, at least I'll reiterate it, I oppose paying for any short-term extension of unemployment benefits. The current level of long-term unemployment is an economic emergency, without any question. And this would be very unfair to the people who are desperately in need of help to say, we're happy to give you this money, but we're going to take something else out of the economy to do it. We're not going to do that. I think that would be wrong. Having said that, Mr. President, there are a number of senators who are having productive conversations about possible offsets, one of whom is on the floor today, my friend, the senator from Ohio. And he's someone that understands finances. He was head of the Office of Management and Budget. So whenever we have him working on numbers, it's always we're always dealing with someone who knows what they're talking about. I don't always agree with his conclusions, but certainly he's a person who we all look to for guidance in this area. As I said a few hours ago here, Mr. President, the Republicans feel this should be paid for. Let's find out how they feel it should be paid for. Again, we on this side don't want a short-term extension. If it's going to be paid for, figure out a year's worth of pay for, and that would be much better than this nickel and diming. If we try to do it for 3 months paid for, I would almost bet that it won't get done. And so we should, if we're going to have pay for, let's try to figure out a way to do it for a year. So we should let the conversations go on overnight. I've spoken to a number of Republican senators, and of course, I want to exert every bit of influence, help, pressure, whatever word we want to use, to try to get this done for a number of reasons, not the least of which one of the co-sponsors of this is the junior senator from Nevada. This is an example of bipartisanship and how it should work. We have one of the most liberal members of the Senate and one of the most conservative members of the Senate working, who have introduced this legislation, and that's what we're working on now. So I repeat, I hope the conversations continue overnight, and we'll see where we are in the morning. Well, yes, I do have a few other things here, Mr. President. We'll be as fast as possible. I ask consent that the Commerce Committee be discharged from further work on H.R. 667.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 667, an act to redesignate the Dryden Flight Research Center as the Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection? Without objection, the committee is discharged.
Mr. President, I ask the bill be read a third time and passed on the motion be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration. S. 1171.
The clerk will report.
S. 1171, a bill to amend the Controlled Substances Act to allow a veterinarian to transport and dispense controlled substances and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection? Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a third time, passed, the motion be considered made and laid on the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the following staff of the Finance Committee be allowed on the Senate floor. Unanimous consent that the following staff of the Finance Committee be allowed on the Senate floor the remainder of this session: Harrison Koval, Carolyn Froman, Maureen Downs.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business day to adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, journal proceedings be approved to date, and the time for two leaders be reserved for use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business until 12 noon, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, and the time equally divided between the two leaders or the designees, with the Republicans controlling the first 30 minutes and the majority of the final 30 minutes. At noon, all post-closure time be considered expired.
Without objection.
So tomorrow we hope to make progress on unemployment insurance extension. Senators will be notified when any votes are scheduled. If there's no further business coming before the Senate, I said adjourn under the previous order following remarks of my friend, Senator from Ohio, Senator Portman.
Without objection. The senator from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me just say that I applaud the Majority Leader for his work on this Neil Armstrong Flight Research Center. This is something that Dianne Feinstein's been very involved with, and Jay Rockefeller supported. And it's an appropriate way to pay tribute to Neil Armstrong, who was a constituent of mine and a dear friend. I spoke to his family about this. They believe it is an appropriate way to pay tribute to him as well. He was a true hero, not just because of what he did as the first man to walk on the moon, but also the way he led his life subsequently. He was a humble hero to me and to so many others, and I'm delighted that through the action we just heard on the floor here a moment ago with the majority leader, we have now passed that legislation. It will go to the President for his signature. And the Dryden Flight Center in California will now be renamed the Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center at the Dryden Aeronautical Test Range. So that's good news tonight. The Senate got something done. I also want to comment on what the President of the Senate said earlier with regard to the retirement provisions in the budget as it relates to our veterans. Military retirement issue was one that I had great concerns about, and when I voted for the budget, it was my understanding that that would be resolved. The gentleman from Connecticut has a proposal that he's supporting tonight from our colleague from New Hampshire. I'm supporting a proposal as well from another colleague from New Hampshire, and how we pay for this I know is a subject to some debate, but we need to resolve this. I think it's unfair for a couple reasons. One is I think it singles out our military at a time when there are so many other ways in which we need to address our overspending in this country, and I think it is not just for us to simply single out military retirees. I believe that that is not consistent with the promise that we have made them, and I believe that it is changing the rules in midstream, in effect. Second, there's a commission looking at this, and the commission is looking at it in a comprehensive way: retirement, benefits, health care. That commission is both comprehensive and transparent, expected to report later this year. So this certainly was not, in my view, appropriate to be in the budget. It's about $6 billion. We certainly should be able to find the pay for in a budget of well over $3 trillion. And so, again, I commend those who are working on this. I have co-sponsored a particular approach that Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire is proposing that is an anti-fraud provision for the child tax credit. I know there's some difference on that, but I would certainly think all of us would want to be sure that the child tax credit is being properly administered, and those who do not qualify for it or are ineligible for it should not access it. At a time of record debts and deficits, we've got to be sure that there is not fraud and abuse and waste in our government, and that is one example. So I would hope that we could find a way to come together on that and deal with that issue. Finally, Mr. President, the Majority Leader talked a little about the legislation that is currently before this body, and that's to extend unemployment insurance. And I want to talk for a moment about where we are on that bill and say that I was encouraged by the words of the Majority Leader, that he sounds like he is interested in looking at various ways that we could pay for it. He indicated he is not in support of paying for it, but he indicated he'd be willing to listen to some of our ideas. Let me say a couple things about it. One, this is the emergency unemployment insurance on top of the roughly 26 weeks that is currently provided by states, like my state of Ohio. So it's additional so-called emergency unemployment insurance on top of that. The unemployment insurance ended at year end, and the question is, do we extend it or not? How do we extend it? How do we deal with the fact that it adds to the deficit? I voted to proceed to this along with a handful of other Republicans because I believe that we ought to have a debate over, one, whether it should be paid for or not, and I think it should be, and I won't be able to support it unless it is paid for, and two, how we can, over the 3-month period, which is what the extension is, it's just a 3-month period, how we can improve the unemployment insurance program so it really works to get people employed. The problem now, as we know, is that we have the highest number of people who are long-term unemployed that we've ever had in this country. It's at historic rates. And it's a very troubling, sad situation where you have people over 27 weeks at historic levels. So we are not doing what we should be doing to connect those people who are unemployed to the jobs that are out there. Clearly, by definition, with so many people long-term unemployed. Let's improve this system. Let's provide people with the job skills that they need, the tools they need to access the jobs that are available. In my own state of Ohio, we have about 100,000 jobs that are open right now, we are told. Many of those jobs are in advanced manufacturing and bioscience and information technology, sectors of our economy where there is a requirement for skills that those who are unemployed do not have. long-term unemployment insurance isn't providing them with that training and those skills opportunities. So I think we ought to be able, as a body, to come up with reforms working with the administration. The President has indicated his interest in doing that. That's why the 3-month extension. But I certainly think we should pay for the 3-month extension. The argument that was made tonight that it's an emergency, well, you know, same Democrats who are saying that are saying the economy is improving. In any case, it violates the budget we just passed. We just passed a budget, not a few weeks ago. It was quite contentious here on the floor. And the budget provided for the first time in 4 years a budget for the House and the Senate to work against so we can start the appropriations process again. I supported that. It had no tax increases. It actually had net deficit reduction in it, barely, but some. It didn't do everything, but it set those budget levels. So we now have caps we can work against so that we can begin the appropriations process, which involves oversight that has not been done appropriately for 4 years now, involves prioritizing spending that has not been done. Frankly, the agencies and departments of the federal government have been kind of on their own with these so-called continuing resolutions because there hasn't been the constitutional requirement that the Congress appropriate every dime. That's our duty, our constitutional duty, the power of the purse. That simply hasn't happened here. So I think the budget's important. But by setting those caps, we made a statement to the American people. We're going to stick to these budget caps, both on the discretionary side, which is the smaller part of the budget that we appropriate every year, and also on the mandatory side. Those caps are violated by unemployment insurance being extended without paying for it. And so, subject to a point of order on the floor of the House and the Senate. And frankly, I think if that point of order were raised, which I hope it would be because we don't want to break these caps, I think it'd be very tough to get the 60 votes. So I understand that the Majority Leader disagrees with me on this, and I respect his opinion. But I do think that because it violates the budget and because we have historic levels of debt and we have a deficit this year which is scheduled, forecasted to be over $600 billion, that you know, we ought to deal with this in a responsible way fiscally and find the money to pay for the extension. It's about $6 billion, about the same as dealing with the military retirement issue. Again, certainly we can find $6 billion in a budget of well over $3 trillion. And in fact, a number of us have come up with specific proposals, and I have introduced a couple of amendments on this today. I spoke about one of these amendments earlier today, but I'd like to go into a little more detail because there were some comments made on the floor earlier that Republicans are only offering 2 alternatives. One is a 1-year delay in Obamacare, which I support, but is opposed by the other side. And second is the proposal on the child tax credit that I talked about earlier that focuses on the current missed payments under the child tax credit. Now, again, I think that's a good pay for. I support that. I'm actually on the amendment which provides for that, that also has enough funds in it to deal with the military retirement issue we talked about. So it could extend the unemployment insurance program for 3 months plus deal with the military retirement program and have a little left over for deficit reduction. But I want to make it clear to those on the other side of the aisle who said that's all Republicans have, that we do have alternatives. I specifically have introduced, filed amendments that I hope will be made in order that say, let's look at the President's own budget and pull out some pay-fors that are within the budget, and let's use those, which certainly should be bipartisan. Specifically, I have 2 provisions that are in my amendment to pay for the extension. One is to remove a current loophole that's in the system that allows double dipping between Social Security disability and unemployment insurance. That's in the President's budget. It's in there because it doesn't make sense to have folks who are on Social Security disability, which is designed for people who are unable to work, to also be drawing unemployment insurance, which is for workers, for people who are out of work and looking for a job. That's a requirement. So clearly, those 2 programs are mutually exclusive, which is why the President's budget includes this prohibition on what's called concurrent receipts. In other words, getting both your SSDI and your unemployment insurance. I add to that trade adjustment assistance, another program where you get as a worker. This is if you lose your job due to trade and some external factors, and you can go through a retraining program, but you're a worker by definition. The same theory applies to both. The same principle applies. So that combination pays for most of the extension of unemployment insurance. I see my colleague from Maine is on the floor this evening. He, along with one of his Democrat colleagues and one of his Republican colleagues, has made a similar proposal in legislation and also filed an amendment along those lines to say, let's clean up this issue. Let's be sure we don't have double dipping, that we do establish clearly that if you're qualified as a non-worker in one case, you can't qualify as a worker in another case. So I do think that is a responsible way to pay for this that would not run afoul of anything that the majority leader said he was concerned about, although, again, I don't have concerns that he does about the child tax credit issue because I think it's a question of missed payments. But I just want to be clear, we do have this proposal out there. On top of that, to be sure that there is additional to pay for the entire amount of the extension of unemployment insurance, we also add an unemployment insurance integrity program straight out of the President's budget. This is to ensure through the Labor Department that there are not improper payments on the existing unemployment insurance program. This will enable us to save money in the long run and help get people into jobs, which I think should be everybody's priority. So these are both proposals that are in the process here. They've been filed. We're hoping that they will be made pending tomorrow and that we can have a debate on these and other amendments. I believe there are several other amendments, including the one from my colleague from Maine, that will say, okay, we'll extend the unemployment insurance program for 3 months to come up with a better unemployment insurance program to improve it so it does connect people to the jobs that are out there, provides the kinds of skills training that is needed, gives people the tools to be able to access those jobs. But we're going to pay for it at a time of historic debts and these large deficits, and at a time when it violates the budget agreement otherwise that we just passed. So I'm hopeful we can make progress on this over the next couple of days, and that we'll be in a position to move forward on dealing with unemployment insurance, improving that. I also filed another amendment that relates to this because part of what we ought to do, in my view, during this 3 months is to tie worker retraining more to unemployment insurance. And Senator Bennett from Colorado and I have something called the Career Act that we have introduced over the last few years. And this Career Act helps to improve the federal worker retraining program, which I believe should be part of this. Specifically, we have a couple of provisions in that legislation that I've introduced as an amendment here to be able to help in terms of the unemployment insurance issue. We want to create an environment where fewer people need unemployment in the first place. And that's why the amendment that I've got would reform local one-stop centers for worker retraining that help connect the unemployed with retraining services by requiring them to give priority consideration to training services that provide workers with in-demand, industry-recognized credentials. We're finding in Ohio and other states that those credentials are what are really needed to get a job often, and that's not being prioritized now in our federal worker retraining program. By the way, the federal government spends about $15 billion a year on these federal retraining programs, so we need to be sure that money is well spent. And again, by definition, it's not working as it should. We've got so many people who are not able to find jobs because of this skills gap. 100,000 jobs in Ohio are open right now. About 400,000 people are out of work, and somehow we can't connect those folks with the jobs, partly because they don't have the skills. Our proposal also includes an innovative approach that's endorsed by the President in his 2014 budget that gives states flexibility to spend some of that Workforce Investment Act formula funds, that's the WIA program, Workforce Investment Act funds, on job training that use the pay-for-success model. What does that mean? Well, the pay-for-success model allows providers who right now are getting funding through this program to be reimbursed only if they generate results, which seems pretty basic, that you should be looking at outcomes, but that's not in the system now. So really it's sort of a pay-for-success or a pay-for-performance program, and it'll ensure that these programs are accountable and they actually produce measurable results for workers. Not only will this save money, but it also, again, will help get Americans back to work, one job at a time. These seem to me to be really responsible proposals that, again, I hope we'll take up here in the Senate and be able to move forward with something that pays for this unemployment insurance extension, but also begins the process of improving unemployment insurance so that it works better for that historic number of long-term unemployed. Finally, this is a great opportunity for us to do things that actually help grow this economy, because ultimately that's the problem, isn't it? Unemployment insurance is taking dollar from one pocket and giving it to someone else. That's needed sometimes. During high unemployment, as we have now, and long-term unemployment being high, something is needed in terms of unemployment insurance. I think most of us agree with that. But ultimately, that's not the solution. The solution is to create more economic growth and therefore more jobs and have fewer people who need to rely on unemployment insurance. So I'm hopeful we can also have discussions about some of those issues. We're not going to reform the tax code here in the next couple of days, but we have to talk about issues like that will really give the economy a shot in the arm. One thing I have introduced along those lines is an amendment to strengthen what's called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. This is to help with the regulations out there that are unfortunately causing more and more burdens to job creators and making it harder to create a job. We know that the cost of regulations is going up. In fact, in 2012, the last year for which we have numbers, the Obama administration regulations cost in 2012 alone was equal to the costs in the first term of the Bush administration and the Clinton administration combined. So more and more regulations, more and more costs, about 4,000 regulations a year. We've got to be sure that we have a process in place to pare down the regulations and make sure that they are based on a real analysis of the costs and the benefits. I was an author of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995 back when I was on the House side, and this particular amendment we've offered today improves that bill. Originally that was an effort to prevent Congress and the federal regulators from blindly imposing economic burdens on the private sector without going through these costs and benefits. I think most people would acknowledge it's been a success. But with today's regulatory environment, we need to upgrade it. We need to modernize it. And this amendment would require agencies to assess the effect of new regulations on job creation, which is not in the current bill, the current act. So it would add that requirement. Let's look at how does this affect creating jobs. That seems, again, like a common sense idea. And require those agencies to consider alternatives to the kind of regulation that's being proposed that might lessen that effect on jobs. It would also broaden the scope of the Unfunded Mandates Act to include rules issued by independent agencies. So right now, independent agencies are not covered by the cost-benefit analysis because, by definition, they're independent from the Office of Management and Budget and from the analysis that's done. Some independent agencies do analysis, some don't, and they use different rules. So this would require all agencies, whether you're an executive branch agency or an independent agency, to live under these same rules of cost-benefit analysis. That makes a lot of sense. The President, by the way, has proposed this himself, not in legislative form, but through executive action. We need to codify what the President talks about. And frankly, he can't do it by executive action because, again, by definition, these are independent agencies, independent of the White House. So our idea here is to bring them into this same cost-benefit analysis to ensure that they are adopting the least burdensome rules possible so that we aren't affecting our economy in negative ways and we can get people back to work. Finally, we do require agencies to look at what the options are, even after the cost-benefit analysis is done, and determine what's the least burdensome way to achieve the same objective. So if you have a new rule being put in place, you would be required to say, okay, how do you get from point A to point B in the least burdensome way to job creators? That, to me, makes a lot of sense, too. With so many Americans out of work, Mr. President, and so many who are looking for a job, who are underemployed, I think it's time for us to look at everything. Regulatory reform would certainly be one. Health care costs is another, and what's happening with Obamacare. Tax reform, looking at our trade policy, be sure we can expand exports. There's lots of things to do, but I think on this regulatory front, this is one, again, where I think we have a lot of bipartisan consensus. We might be able to move forward with something. So I know we're debating the extension of unemployment benefits today, not all these other issues, but they're all part of it. We've got to make sure that we are creating an environment for success, that we are creating the opportunity for job creators to invest, to take a risk, to begin to get the money off the sidelines in this economy and put it to work. And that will require us to make some changes here in Washington in terms of the way we approach these issues to free up the private sector to do what they do best, which is to create more jobs and opportunity. Again, I was very pleased to hear the Senate Majority Leader express a willingness to include good amendments, reasonable amendments, offsets to the cost of this legislation. I do hope that he will work with us to ensure that we can move forward on this in a way that does take on some of these issues of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, the kind of things we're talking about, of being sure there's not double dipping, being sure there's not concurrent receipts with disability plus unemployment insurance and TAA, but rather to ensure that if you're working, you're getting the benefits that you're eligible for. If you're not working, you can get those benefits, but not both. These are just sensible provisions, and again, reflective of what's in the President's own budget. If we can do that and pay for this for 3 months and then go to work as Republicans and Democrats and independents alike, because there's an independent on the floor tonight, to resolve not just whether we extend unemployment or not, but this deeper issue of how do you have the unemployment program work to get people into jobs that are available out there. Again, record levels of long-term unemployment means we've got a real problem. It's not working. And then second, how do we grow this underlying economy? How do we get the jobs back through economic growth and through creating more opportunity for everyone to get middle-class wages back up and benefits back up, to enable every American to have a shot at that American dream by giving people the equal opportunity that they deserve. Mr. President, thank you for staying late tonight in your indulgence, and I yield back the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Senators continued debating today whether or not to reinstate long-term unemployment benefits. The emergency law that extended jobless benefits beyond the traditional 26 weeks expired at the end of December, ending the program for more than 1 million people. Final Senate action on the proposal could come by the end of the week. However, Republican leaders in the House say they will not bring up the bill. During today's session, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell talked about his view of the Senate. More than 30 of his Republican colleagues were in the chamber to hear his speech. This is 40 Minutes.
Mr. President.